My 83-year-old grandmother was an Instagram power user. She had learned to use the social media network that's popular with millennials and young adults because she found it to be a great way of staying in touch with her 9 grandkids. She knew how to take pictures and edit them and share them. She knew how to see what her grandkids were posting and react with emojis. She could even record video and post it to the stories on the social media site. She loved Instagram and was a great user of it. It wasn't just Instagram. She knew how to read books on a Kindle. She knew how to play music from her iPhone on her JBL Charge Bluetooth speakers. When I think about my grandma and in some of her final years, I like to think of her cruising around her retirement community on a scooter, listening to music on her Bluetooth speakers with a cat sitting on her lap. My grandma had a lot of fun hanging out on social media and learning to use digital technology. But in some ways, those last few years were difficult because though she could connect with her grandkids on social media, she couldn't connect with a place that was so important throughout her life. My grandma had been a member of the same church in central Wisconsin for about 5 decades. It was a church that was deeply important to her social life and more importantly, to her walk with God. As my grandma aged, she moved to a retirement community that was some 40 minutes away from that church. The move distanced her from the congregation. No longer able to participate in worship and singing and prayer, she felt a bit distanced from the community. Sure, there were times where family members were able to bring her to the sanctuary, pushing her wheelchair through the narrow hallways and down the aisles. But most Sunday mornings felt a little absent for her, like she was lonely and disconnected. I shared that story this morning because it illustrates precisely what we're looking for in this conversation about hybrid ministry. So often when we think of hybrid ministry, our thoughts go to 2 places. First of all, that hybrid ministry is about reaching young people. And second of all, that hybrid ministry is about combining the online and the offline. I want to spend a few moments dispelling both of those, because both are untrue. Hybrid ministry isn't about combining the online with the offline, and it's important that we not think of it that way, because when we do, we set ourselves up as church leaders for a bit of disappointment. What we do is we double our to-do list. We make ourselves busier, and we set ourselves up for burnout. Nor is hybrid ministry fundamentally geared towards reaching young people. The fact is, everybody in this tech-shaped culture lives online. Pew Research tells us that the fastest growing segments on social media are people who are currently in their 70s and 80s, just like my grandma. Today we're going to be talking about hybrid ministry, the church's new normal, and how we can be church in a tech-shaped culture. We start this way because it's important to understand what hybrid ministry isn't before we can understand what hybrid ministry might be. My name is Ryan Panzer. I'm the author of Grace Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. I'm a writer and researcher on how churches can use technology not just as an add-on or as a flashy tool that in some way makes their churches more appealing in a digital age, but as a way that supports us in being more missional. It's something that helps us to live into our baptismal vocations, that allows us to fulfill our mission and to love and to serve our neighbor. Now, to understand what hybrid ministry could be in our new normal, we want to take a look at the church we were in February of 2020, the church we became in March of that year, and then at the church that we must become. Because when we look at those 3 stages of church and what church has been over this last year and a half, we can understand what the missional opportunity is of doing hybrid ministry. Let's start with the church we were. When we look back on February 2020, sometimes we do so with a bit of nostalgia. Like the community that we enjoyed within our buildings, within our sanctuaries, all seated closely together in the pews, was perhaps the epitome of church community. And indeed, there were many things that were great about the church that we were. One of the things that I'm particularly drawn to when I think about church community is how efficient it was. And you might think efficiency is a little bit of a strange concept to think about in church circles, to think about in the context of faith community. But it's remarkable. The average American who is a member of a church spent just 8.3 minutes per day in church activities. Now, if we compare that to the time they spent watching television, 2.5 hours per day, we know that even in the church we were, people did not spend very much time at all within the buildings, being part of their church community. But still, just those 8.3 minutes that they spent with their church on average each day led to some pretty big impact. You see, those who were members of the church that we were prior to March of last year were far more likely to volunteer, to give of their time, to give of their treasure. They were more likely to run for political office, to be involved with their schools. They were more likely to vote. They were even more likely to give blood. A lot of this data, by the way, comes to us from Robert Putnam, one of my favorite sociologists. And in his book, American Grace, Putnam describes the remarkable ways that church community, as we understood it prior to the pandemic, was so effective at equipping individuals for lives of faithful service. That was what was unique and distinctive about the analog church, the church that took place within the four walls of our buildings while we were all sitting in the pews together, is that it took these moments where we were together for only a few moments and built something, a community of discipleship, a community of service, living out their vocations in response to God's call to love and to serve the neighbor. Now, part of the reason that churches were so effective at equipping individuals for service in the church we were was because of a concept called weak ties. It's not just that church made us best friends with our pastors and with everybody in our church community. Rather, it introduced us to a lot of people. People who gave us ideas of how we could live out our calling to serve. People who gave us opportunities to serve, who shared their resources with us, who shared their ideas with us. I remember several years ago, I was sitting with my grandma at her church in central Wisconsin, and the priest announced that one of the individuals in their congregation needed some help moving. You see, her fiance had just passed away, and she needed to move to a different apartment. Not having the funds to hire a moving company, she needed to find a way to get all of her furniture and all of her living supplies out of the apartment by the end of the weekend and relocated to a new home on the other side of that town. An individual in the church raised their hand, something a bit unusual in the middle of a church service, and offered use of his pickup truck. Two others offered to lift couches. Two more volunteered to carry things down the stairs. Even the priest himself volunteered to pack some boxes. What's interesting about that story is that that individual who had tragically lost her fiance wasn't a long-term member of the congregation. In fact, from what my understanding, she had only been there just a few times. Yet in that small church, so many stepped up. They didn't know her well, but they knew her just well enough to want to be of service to her. That was the distinctive strength of the analog church, the church that we were prior to the pandemic. Not just that it made us friends and best buddies with those that we sat next to, but that it gave us an opportunity to serve and the ties with whom to serve. Now, the church we were prior to the pandemic wasn't perfect. It was a bit insular, and it wasn't particularly inviting. Anyone who's ever walked into an old church might be able to tell you about the steps that often times mark the entrance to church buildings. That was certainly the case in my grandma's church. 10 steps that everyone had to walk up to just to participate in a worship service. There were other factors, of course, that inhibited individuals from participating in analog church community. Some physical, some psychological, some spiritual. But the fact remains that the analog church prior to the pandemic wasn't particularly adept at inviting, at being widespread inclusive. So when we look at the church we became during the pandemic, the remarkable pivot that we took is not towards a church that was primarily online, but towards a church that was by definition always inviting. Research from the Barna Group tells us that 96% of churches shifted their worship services online in March and April of 2020. What's interesting, though, isn't that so many churches went online, but it's how so many people connected to churches. The same study from the Barna Group shows that 66% of churched adults watched online. That represented a 50% increase in attendance. Perhaps your congregation experienced something similar. Individuals who had long been distanced from your church, perhaps because of ailment, perhaps because of a geographic move, perhaps just because of a work schedule or a busy life, were suddenly able to return through digital technology, to join back in their faith community through the magic of a screen. If the church that we were was great at equipping individuals for service, but not so great at it being inviting, and if the church that we became was great at inviting, but lacked the ties that formed us for service, then the church that what we must become in our new normal somehow takes the best of those two. It combines the ability to be able to equip individuals for faithful service within their neighborhood contexts, just as it takes the ability to invite and to include individuals regardless of their location or their ability to walk into the sanctuary on a Sunday morning. That's what hybrid ministry is all about: equipping and inviting, forming individuals for lives of faithful service, and being inclusive. When we focus on those two factors, equipping and inviting, hybrid ministry doesn't become a painstaking exercise in using church technology. Rather, it becomes the joyful pursuit of a new way of being church that's better for the age that we're living in. It's a way of church that takes the strength of in-person community and the invitational reach of online connection. When I think about the church we must become, I'm drawn to the last coffee hour that I participated in at my church. It took place on March 8th, 2020, 5 days before a state of emergency was declared and buildings shut their doors. On March 8th, I had no idea how much I would miss the individuals that I served coffee with, those who I chatted with over donuts. I wish I would have lingered a little bit on March 8th as we all filed out of the sanctuary for the last time in many months. Because what we lost during the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't the ability to be together. Digital technology brought us together in ways we had never before imagined. Rather, we lost those ties, those often weak ties that were so important to our lives of service and to our lives of discipleship. Now, my wife and I had a habit of staying around for coffee and donuts, and we usually didn't stay for very long. Typically here, our service ends around 11 a.m., and we're usually out the door reliably by 11:13 every Sunday morning. That Sunday was no different. I quickly filled up my cup of coffee, grabbed a Dunkin' Donut for the road, and closed the door behind us. I wish I would have stayed a few minutes longer. I wish I would have talked a little bit more. I wish I would have paused to just give thanks for those who were part of that analog faith community that was so important prior to the pandemic. What do we do then to build a bridge? How do we take the strength of that in-person community and put it together with the invitational nature of online church? How do we create a church service that equips not just those that I enjoyed greeting at coffee hour, but also includes those like my grandma, who couldn't walk up the steps of the church in her final years? That's what hybrid ministry is all about. We're going to take a short break. And as we do, I have a question that I'd like you to consider. How can your ministry context use hybrid ministry to be more invitational and more inclusive? Whether you're part of a church, a summer camp, a synod office, or some other ministry context, think about the ways that hybrid ministry extends the reach of the mission that you're called to into a digital age. Think about that question, post your thoughts in the chat, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how hybrid ministry represents the greatest change opportunity, but also the greatest change challenge of our times.